No one expected the emergency that walked into Mercy Valley Hospital that morning, because it didn't arrive in an ambulance. It walked in on 4 legs. The automatic doors slid open, and a massive dairy cow stepped calmly into the lobby, her hooves echoing across the silent floor. At first, people thought it had to be a mistake. An animal couldn't possibly know how to enter a hospital. But what unsettled everyone was the way she moved. Slow, steady, and certain, like she knew exactly where she was going. When a senior doctor carefully approached her, hand extended, the hallway held its breath. Then suddenly, she lunged. Gasps filled the corridor as she slammed him against the wall, pinning him there with terrifying strength. Nurses shouted, security rushed forward. For a moment it looked like pure violence, but then she released him, turned, and began walking deeper into the hospital, straight toward one specific room. Inside lay a farmer in a coma, the very man who had raised her since she was a calf. And what happened next left even the doctors questioning everything they thought they knew about animals and loyalty. Before we continue, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? And if stories like this touch your heart, don't forget to subscribe, because this is one you will never forget. The morning had begun like any other at Mercy Valley Hospital, quiet, predictable, almost sleepy beneath the pale glow of early winter light. A thin frost still clung to the edges of parked cars outside, and the air carried that brittle cold that made every breath visible. Inside, the lobby hummed softly with routine life. A receptionist sorting paperwork, a nurse guiding an elderly patient toward radiology, the distant rhythm of monitors pulsing from somewhere deeper in the building. Nothing about that hour suggested it would soon become one of the most talked-about mornings in the hospital's history. Then the automatic doors slid open. At first, no one noticed anything unusual, but a second later came a sound that did not belong, a heavy, deliberate clop against the polished floor. Then another. Conversations faltered. The receptionist slowly lifted her head, her expression tightening in confusion before draining entirely of color. A cow was walking into the hospital. She was enormous, easily over 1,000 pounds, her pale coat still dusted with the faint sparkle of melting frost. Wisps of cold air curled off her body as she stepped fully inside, her dark eyes scanning the space with a focus that felt almost unsettling. Yet what struck everyone most was not her size, it was her calm. She wasn't slipping or scrambling on the tile. She wasn't panicked the way animals usually were in unfamiliar places. Instead, she moved with steady purpose, each step measured, as though she had already decided exactly where she needed to go. For several seconds, the lobby froze with her. A coffee cup slipped from someone's hand and shattered loudly, but the cow did not react. An elderly man blinked hard, certain his vision had betrayed him. Somewhere behind the desk, a phone began ringing, unanswered. Security was called almost immediately, their voices crackling urgently over handheld radios. Before they could arrive, however, Dr. Harris, a broad-shouldered physician who had grown up on a farm, stepped cautiously forward. Years of working around large animals had taught him that fear often escalated situations faster than anything else. Keeping his movements slow, he extended one open hand, speaking in the low, reassuring tone he once used with skittish horses. For a moment it seemed to work. The cow slowed. Her breathing softened. Her massive head dipped slightly, and a fragile ripple of relief passed through the watching staff. Then, without warning, everything shattered. With explosive force, the cow surged forward and drove Dr. Harris backward into the wall. A metallic crash rang out as a mounted tray rattled violently. Someone screamed. Another shouted for everyone to clear the hallway. Yet the strangest part, the detail no one could later explain, was that she did not continue the attack. She did not trample him or strike again. Instead, she held him there for a heartbeat. 2. Trembling, her wide eyes reflecting something far closer to desperation than rage. And just as suddenly as it began, she released him. The corridor fell silent, except for the doctor's shaken breaths. The cow turned away from the chaos behind her and started down the hallway, ignoring the open exit doors, the shouting staff, even the security guards rushing toward her. She passed room after room without a glance, her hooves echoing steadily as tension followed in her wake. It was only when she stopped outside room 214 that the unease deepened into something else entirely. She pressed her head gently against the closed door and let out a low, broken cry. For several long seconds after the impact, no one moved. The hallway seemed suspended in a strange, fragile silence, as though the entire building had forgotten how to breathe. Dr. Harris remained against the wall where the force had driven him, stunned more by the shock than the pain, his palm still half raised in the calming gesture he had attempted only moments before. A nurse hurried toward him but stopped short, unsure whether sudden movement might trigger the animal again, yet the cow did not look back. Whatever urgency burned inside her seemed fixed on only one thing: the closed door of room 214. Security arrived at a cautious jog, their radios hissing with overlapping instructions. One guard whispered that they should guide her outside immediately before someone else got hurt. Another suggested calling animal control, but the moment anyone stepped too close, the cow shifted her weight and angled her body protectively toward the door, a quiet warning that needed no translation. It was not aggression now that radiated from her, but an immovable refusal. Her muscles quivered beneath her hide, not with wildness, but with strain, the kind that comes from holding oneself together when every instinct is pulling in a different direction. Inside the room, machines continued their steady chorus of beeps, unaware of the gathering crowd just beyond the wall. When charge nurse Elena finally pushed through the cluster of staff to check the patient chart, her practiced composure faltered. She read the name once, then again, as if expecting the letters to rearrange themselves into something less startling. Thomas Hale, 62, severe cardiac arrest, oxygen deprivation, unresponsive for 3 days. A younger nurse leaned closer. Hale, isn't that the farmer from Greenridge? Another staff member nodded slowly. In rural counties, names travelled quickly, woven into feed stores, harvest seasons, and local fairs. Thomas was known as a quiet man who spoke more comfortably to animals than to crowds, a widower who had kept his land running long after most neighbours had sold theirs. And among those who knew the farm best, there had always been one gentle joke repeated with fond certainty, that his favourite cow followed him with the loyalty of a dog. As this realization rippled through the hallway, several sets of eyes drifted back toward the animal standing vigil at the door. Up close, details emerged that panic had hidden before. Mud clung to her lower legs, hardened by miles of travel. One flank was streaked where frost had melted into dampness. Her breathing carried a faint rasp, the sound of exhaustion pushed too far. Whatever distance lay between Greenridge Farm and Mercy Valley, she had crossed it without hesitation. The cow lifted her head and nudged the door again, softer this time, releasing a low, trembling sound that seemed to vibrate through the floor itself. It was not the impatient bellow of livestock waiting to be fed. It was deeper, almost aching. Conversations dimmed. Even those determined to remain practical felt something uneasy stir in their chest, a quiet suggestion that this was not behavior easily explained away. Dr. Harris, regaining his balance, studied her with a furrowed brow. "She's not trying to hurt anyone," he said quietly, more to himself than to the others. "She's guarding something, or someone." Hospital protocol did not have a chapter for moments like this. Rules spoke clearly about sanitation, liability, controlled environments, all the reasons an animal could not be allowed beyond those doors. Yet rules felt strangely fragile in the presence of the cow's unwavering stance. Each time someone proposed moving her, she answered by stepping closer to the threshold, planting her hooves with calm finality. At last, Eleanor exhaled slowly, her hand resting on the door handle. "Let me look at him," she murmured. She slipped inside. The room remained dim, blinds half drawn against the sharp winter glare. Thomas Hale lay motionless beneath thin blankets, the steady rise of his chest assisted more by machines than by strength of his own. Days had passed without the smallest flicker of response. Doctors had begun using careful words with the family, words like uncertain and prepare. When Elena opened the door again, the cow leaned forward immediately, stopping just short of the frame, as if sensing an invisible boundary she dared not cross without permission. For a moment, nurse and animal regarded one another in silence. Then the cow released another soft, fractured cry, and something about that sound, raw, insistent, almost pleading, made the rigid certainty of hospital procedure feel suddenly, profoundly inadequate. For a long moment, no one spoke. The sound the cow had made still seemed to linger in the air, low and aching, pressing gently against the nerves of everyone gathered in the hallway. Even those who had never spent a day around farm animals felt it. That unmistakable tone of distress that needed no translation. It was the kind of sound that bypassed logic and went straight to the chest. "She knows him," one nurse whispered, almost afraid to say it aloud. Dr. Harris did not answer immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the animal, studying her with a focus that had replaced the earlier shock. The tremor in her body was more visible now. Her legs, caked faintly with dirt and salt from winter roads, hinted at miles traveled without rest. A thin line of foam traced the edge of her mouth, the mark of exhaustion rather than illness. Whatever had driven her here had not allowed time for hesitation. "Open the door," he said quietly. There was a pause. Protocol resisted, training resisted, but something deeper, something profoundly human, tipped the balance. Elena pushed the door wider. The cow stepped forward, not rushed, not wild, just one careful step, then another, her hooves surprisingly soft against the hospital floor. She stopped beside the bed, towering gently over the still figure beneath the blankets. Up close, Thomas Hale looked smaller than the man many remembered, his weathered hands unmoving, his skin drained of the sun-worn color earned through decades of fieldwork. Machines traced thin green lines beside him, each beep a reminder that his life now hung on fragile rhythms. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the cow lowered her massive head. She did not touch him at first, only hovered there, her breath slow and warm, stirring the edge of the blanket. Her nostrils flared as if memorizing a scent she already knew by heart. The room fell into a silence so complete that even the monitors seemed quieter, their steady pulse softened by the weight of the moment. And then she let out a sound unlike anything the staff had heard before. It was softer than the cry in the hallway, almost a hum, deep and vibrating, carrying a tenderness that made Elena's throat tighten unexpectedly. The cow nudged the mattress gently, once, then again, the careful motion of an animal that understood her own strength and feared misusing it. "Has he responded at all this week?" Dr. Harris asked under his breath. Eleanor shook her head. "Not once." As if summoned by the question, the monitor flickered. At first, the change was so slight it could have been dismissed as interference, a tiny quickening in the rhythm, a subtle climb before settling again. But the nurse nearest the screen leaned closer, her brow knitting. "Wait!" Another beep followed, stronger. Elena stepped toward the bed. "Thomas?" she called softly, though she had learned not to expect an answer. The cow shifted, pressing her forehead lightly against the side of his arm, and there, so faint it might have been imagined, his finger moved. No one breathed. "Did you see that?" the nurse whispered, her voice trembling between disbelief and hope. They watched, every pair of eyes fixed on that weathered hand. Seconds stretched thin. Then, once more, the smallest twitch, fragile but undeniable. A stunned silence spread through the room before breaking into overlapping murmurs. It could be reflex. After 3 days. Check the vitals again. But explanations sounded weaker now, their clinical edges dulled by what they had just witnessed. The cow remained perfectly still beside him, her dark gaze resting on his face with unwavering focus. Outside the doorway, more staff had gathered, drawn by the quiet gravity pulling everyone closer. No one spoke of removing her anymore. Minutes passed, yet something subtle had shifted in the atmosphere, as though hope, long dormant, had stirred awake. Dr. Harris folded his arms slowly, his voice barely above a murmur. Sometimes, he said, almost to himself, the body remembers what the mind cannot reach. The cow exhaled, a slow, steady breath that brushed across Thomas's hand, and for the first time since his heart had failed him, the machines beside his bed no longer sounded like they were counting down, but like they were waiting. Word traveled through Mercy Valley Hospital faster than anyone expected. By midday, nurses from distant wings found reasons to pass by room 214. Doctors paused outside under the pretense of reviewing charts, and even staff who prided themselves on clinical detachment felt drawn toward the quiet gravity gathering there. Hospitals were places of science, schedules, and controlled outcomes. Yet what was unfolding inside that room seemed to belong to an older language, one that had nothing to do with textbooks. Thomas Hale's condition had not magically reversed, and no one dared claim that it had. But the small movements, the trembling finger, the subtle changes in heart rhythm had unsettled the certainty that had settled over his case. For 3 long days, his body had remained unresponsive, suspended somewhere unreachable. Now, with the cow standing beside him, that stillness no longer felt absolute. "She shouldn't be in here," one administrator muttered quietly, though without the conviction such statements usually carried. Yet no one stepped forward to enforce the rule. The cow had not moved from her place near the bed. Time seemed irrelevant to her. She neither asked for food nor reacted to the bucket of water someone cautiously slid into the corner. Now and then, she lowered her head as if listening for something deeper than breath, releasing that same low hum that resonated more like comfort than sound. Strangely, it soothed the room. Conversations softened around it. Even the machines felt less intrusive. Later that afternoon, Thomas's daughter Caroline arrived. Grief had carved shadows beneath her eyes over the past few days, the kind that came from too little sleep and too many careful conversations with doctors. She was speaking hurriedly into her phone as she approached the corridor, but the words fell away the moment she saw what stood beyond the doorway. For a second, she simply stared. Maple. The name escaped her in a fragile whisper. The cow lifted her head immediately at the sound, ears turning forward. Recognition passed through her posture like a ripple, subtle but unmistakable. Caroline pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. "I don't understand. How did she even get here?" No one had an answer, but Caroline did not seem to need one. Slowly, she stepped into the room, her gaze moving between her father and the animal he had loved with a devotion most people reserved for family. Memories surfaced all at once, her father bottle-feeding a wobbly-legged calf in the kitchen during an early spring frost, laughing when the tiny creature tried to follow him back outside. Winter nights when he slept in the barn after Maple fell ill, refusing to leave her alone. The way she trailed behind him across the fields long after she had grown too large for such closeness. "She used to wait by the fence every evening," Caroline murmured, her voice thick with emotion. Dad swore she knew the sound of his truck from half a mile away. As if stirred by the familiar voice, Maple stepped closer to the bed and gently brushed her muzzle against Thomas's shoulder. The movement was so careful, so deliberate, that it seemed guided by an instinct older than fear. Caroline watched, tears slipping free despite her effort to contain them. He always said animals remember kindness longer than we do. Almost on cue, the monitor shifted again, a steadier cadence now, less erratic than before. Elena noticed it first and exchanged a glance with Dr. Harris, neither willing to speak the fragile hope forming between them. "Dad," Caroline whispered, leaning closer, "Maple came to see you. You don't have to fight alone anymore." The cow released a slow breath that stirred the edge of the blanket, her dark eyes never leaving his face. And though Thomas did not wake, the tension that had gripped his features for days seemed at last to ease. As if somewhere beyond reach, he recognized that the one presence he had never failed was now quietly keeping watch beside him. By early evening, the winter light had begun its slow retreat, fading into long amber streaks that stretched across the hospital floor. Inside room 214, the atmosphere had shifted into something almost sacred. The usual rush of hospital life seemed to pause at the doorway, as though reluctant to disturb the fragile thread holding the moment together. Maple had still not left Thomas's side. Hours had passed, yet she stood with the same unwavering patience, her massive frame rising and falling in a steady rhythm that strangely mirrored the softened cadence of the heart monitor beside him. Staff rotated quietly through the room, checking vitals, adjusting lines, recording observations they could not fully explain. No one spoke loudly anymore. Even those who had initially objected to the animal's presence now moved with a gentler awareness, careful not to break whatever invisible connection seemed to hum between the farmer and the cow he had raised. Caroline sat close to the bed, one hand wrapped around her father's weathered fingers. From time to time, Maple leaned forward, her warm breath brushing across Thomas's arm, as though reassuring herself that he was still there. Each time she did, the monitor responded with the faintest increase, not dramatic enough to declare a turning point, but consistent enough that it could no longer be dismissed outright. Dr. Harris studied the screen again, then glanced toward Elena. "It's subtle," he murmured, "but his heart rate has been more stable since she came in." Elena nodded slowly. "I stopped calling it coincidence an hour ago." Near the window, dusk gathered quietly, painting the sky in muted shades of violet. A hush settled over the room, the kind that often arrives just before nightfall, when the world seems to inhale and hold it. Maple shifted her weight and lowered herself carefully onto the floor for the first time, folding her legs beneath her with surprising grace despite her size. The movement drew Caroline's attention. "She must be exhausted," she whispered. As if understanding, Maple stretched her neck upward once more and rested the side of her muzzle gently along the mattress near Thomas's hand. Her eyes softened, lids drooping but never fully closing, determined to remain present. Minutes slipped by. Then Caroline felt it, a faint pressure against her palm. She froze, her breath catching halfway. "Doctor!" Her voice trembled. "I think he just squeezed my hand." Dr. Harris stepped forward immediately, watching closely. At first, there was nothing, only the steady rise of Thomas's chest. But then, slowly, his fingers curled again, this time with slightly more strength than before. Elena's eyes widened. "Thomas, can you hear us?" The monitor answered with a stronger, more deliberate rhythm. Caroline's tears spilled freely now. "Dad, it's me. You're okay. Maple's here too. She found you." At the sound of her name, Maple released a deep, rolling hum that vibrated softly through the bed frame. The effect was almost instantaneous. Thomas's brow twitched, the faintest crease forming as if he were reaching toward consciousness from somewhere far away. No one dared interrupt the moment. Outside, a few staff members gathered silently, drawn once again by the quiet shift in energy. Hospitals were familiar with recoveries, with setbacks, with the unpredictable nature of the human body. But this felt different, less like a sudden miracle, and more like a door being nudged open after days of stubborn darkness. Dr. Harris folded his arms, amazement flickering across his usually composed expression. "I've practiced medicine for 30 years, he said softly, "and I still can't fully explain what pulls someone back." Caroline brushed a tear from her cheek and managed a small, fragile smile. Maybe he just needed something familiar to follow home. Maple exhaled slowly, her breath warm against Thomas's skin, and for the first time since the machines had taken over the rhythm of his survival, it no longer felt as though they were fighting alone. Night settled gently over Mercy Valley Hospital, wrapping the building in a quiet stillness, broken only by the distant hum of generators and the soft shuffle of overnight staff beginning their rounds. Inside room 214, the lights had been dimmed, casting a warm glow that softened the sharp edges of medical equipment. The world beyond the windows had disappeared into darkness, but within that room, something unmistakably alive had begun to grow. Not certainty, not yet, but hope strong enough to be felt. Maple had not slept. Though her body showed the strain of the long journey and the endless hours standing watch, she remained alert, lifting her head at every small movement from the bed. Occasionally, she released that low, comforting hum, a sound the nurses had begun to recognize as her way of reaching toward Thomas when words were impossible. Strangely, it seemed to calm more than just the patient. Several staff members admitted later that the sound steadied their nerves during a shift that might otherwise have felt unbearably long. Shortly after midnight, Thomas stirred again. It began with a deeper breath, not the mechanical rhythm the machines encouraged, but something more natural, more deliberate. Elena noticed it first while reviewing his chart and stepped closer, her trained eyes scanning for changes. His eyelids fluttered faintly, then settled. She leaned forward. "Thomas, if you can hear me, try to move." For a moment, nothing followed. Then Maple rose. The motion was immediate, almost instinctive, as though she had sensed the shift before any monitor could announce it. She stepped closer to the bed and gently nudged the blanket near his shoulder. The contact was feather-light despite her size, guided by a care that spoke of long familiarity. Thomas inhaled sharply. Caroline, who had dozed lightly in the chair beside him, woke at once. "Dad?" Her voice trembled between fear and fragile hope. His brow tightened. Another breath came, stronger this time, and his fingers flexed against the blanket as though remembering their purpose. Dr. Harris was called from down the hall, arriving moments later with quiet urgency, but even his practiced calm could not fully hide his astonishment. "This is significant," he whispered, after checking the readings. "Very significant." Maple lowered her head until her muzzle rested near Thomas's hand again. The farmer's fingers shifted, then slowly curled into the coarse hair along her jaw. It was not a reflex. It was a grasp. Caroline let out a broken sob, pressing her hand to her mouth as tears blurred her vision. "He knows she's here. He knows." The room seemed to hold its breath. Thomas's lips parted slightly, a faint sound escaping, too fragile to form words, yet unmistakably human. His eyelids trembled once more before lifting just a fraction, enough to reveal a thin line of unfocused blue. Though his gaze could not yet settle, it drifted toward the shape beside him, guided perhaps by memory deeper than sight. Maple answered with a soft, rolling hum. The effect was immediate. The tension in his face eased and his breathing steadied into a rhythm that no machine could manufacture. It was the kind of change doctors waited days to see, sometimes weeks, and yet it was unfolding quietly in the presence of the animal many had once tried to keep outside. Dr. Harris exhaled slowly, shaking his head in wonder. "I've seen patients respond to voices they love," he murmured, "but this This is something rare. Caroline brushed her father's hair back gently. You can rest now, she whispered to him, though her eyes flickered gratefully toward Maple. She kept her promise. She found you. Beyond the doorway, word spread again in hushed excitement. Nurses who had witnessed countless recoveries admitted they had never felt a shift quite like this. Not dramatic, not sudden, but deeply certain, like the first pale line of dawn after an endless night. Thomas's grip weakened as sleep reclaimed him, but it did not fall away completely. His fingers remained tangled lightly in Maple's fur. She did not move, unwilling to disturb even that fragile contact. And as the hours crept toward morning, it became clear to everyone watching that whatever had guided the cow across frozen miles to this hospital had arrived exactly when it was needed most. Dawn returned quietly to Mercy Valley Hospital, spilling pale gold light through the narrow gap in the blinds and washing room 214 in the fragile color of a new beginning. The long winter night had passed without alarms, without sudden drops in rhythm, without the tense urgency that had hovered over Thomas Hale's bed for days. Instead, there was a steadiness now, subtle but undeniable, like the calm surface of a lake after a storm has finally moved on. Maple was still there. She had barely shifted from her place beside the bed, her patient seeming untouched by fatigue. When the first rays of sunlight warmed the floor, they traced the curve of her back and caught gently in the soft brown of her eyes. Every so often she blinked slowly, watching the quiet rise and fall of Thomas's chest, as if counting each breath herself. Nurses passing the doorway no longer reacted with surprise. Instead, they offered small smiles, their earlier disbelief replaced by a quiet respect. Caroline stirred awake in her chair and immediately leaned toward her father, searching his face for the signs she now dared to hope for. Overnight, the tightness that once gripped his features had eased. The deep lines carved by strain seemed softer, and the grey pallor of his skin carried the faintest return of warmth. Then, without warning, his eyelids fluttered. Caroline straightened so quickly, her chair scraped softly against the floor. "Dad," she whispered, afraid that speaking too loudly might shatter the moment. His lashes trembled again and lifted. At first, his gaze was unfocused, drifting across the ceiling as though he were trying to remember where the sky had gone. A slow breath filled his lungs, deeper than any he had taken in days. Confusion flickered faintly across his expression, the natural disorientation of someone returning from very far away. Dr. Harris stepped closer but said nothing, allowing the moment to unfold without interruption. Thomas's eyes moved again, wandering until they met the large, familiar shape standing quietly beside him. He blinked once, then twice. A fragile awareness settled into his stare. Maple responded instantly, releasing a low, trembling hum that seemed to vibrate with restrained emotion. She leaned forward, careful as always, and brushed her muzzle lightly against the back of his hand. Thomas's lips parted. For a second, no sound came. Only the visible effort of forming something his body had nearly forgotten how to do. Caroline clasped his fingers gently. "You're safe," she whispered, tears already gathering. "We're right here." His throat worked, and at last a hoarse breath shaped itself into a word so faint they almost missed it. "Maple." Caroline broke into quiet sobs, bowing her head as relief washed through her. Even Dr. Harris looked away briefly, giving the family the privacy of his composure. The cow's ears tipped forward at the sound of her name. She stepped closer, her dark eyes soft, and Thomas's fingers curled weakly into the short hair along her jaw. Not with strength, but with unmistakable intention. Recognition passed between them in that touch, simple and profound, needing no explanation. "You came back to me," he whispered after a moment, the words thin but certain. Maple answered with another gentle hum, lowering her head until it rested near his shoulder. The monitor beside the bed maintained its calm, steady rhythm, but now it felt less like a machine keeping time and more like a quiet witness to a reunion few would ever forget. Outside the room, morning staff gathered in respectful silence. Some would later admit they had never believed stories about animals sensing the edges of life, not until now. Thomas closed his eyes briefly, not from weakness this time, but from a deep, gathering rest. When he opened them again, the confusion had lessened, replaced by a fragile clarity. Caroline brushed a tear from her cheek and laughed softly through it. She walked into a hospital to find you, Dad. Nearly terrified the entire staff. A faint smile touched his lips. Sounds like her, he murmured. Sunlight crept higher, filling the room with warmth, and in that gentle glow it became clear to everyone watching that this was no longer a story about a patient who might wake, but about a bond strong enough to guide him all the way back. By the third morning, Mercy Valley Hospital no longer felt quite like itself. What had begun as shock had softened into something warmer, something quietly extraordinary that staff would speak about for years, whenever new nurses asked why room 214 seemed almost famous. Word had travelled beyond the building now, through town diners, across the feed store, along frozen fence lines, until nearly everyone knew the story of the cow who had walked miles to stand beside the man who once refused to give up on her. Thomas Hale was stronger, not fully recovered, not yet ready to leave the careful watch of machines and medication, but unmistakably returning. Colour had crept back into his cheeks, and his voice, though still rough with weakness, carried more certainty each time he spoke. Doctors called it remarkable progress. Caroline simply called it a second chance. Maple remained a steady presence through it all. Hospital administration, after much discussion and more than a little surrender to the improbable, had arranged brief daily visits rather than forcing a separation that now felt almost unthinkable. Each time she was led carefully down the corridor, conversations paused, and even strangers found themselves stepping aside with quiet reverence. There was something about the calm determination in her walk that made people instinctively lower their voices. On this particular morning, sunlight poured generously through the wide windows, chasing away the last hints of winter gloom. Thomas sat slightly elevated in his bed, supported by pillows, studying the doorway with the patient anticipation of someone waiting for a familiar footstep. When Maple appeared at last, guided gently by a staff member, his tired face brightened in a way no medication could produce. "Well, there you are," he whispered. She approached without hesitation and lowered her head beside him. His hand lifted, slower than it once had, but steady, and rested against the broad curve of her cheek. For several seconds he said nothing, simply breathing in the quiet comfort of her presence. "You know," he murmured eventually, his voice threaded with emotion, "when she was just a calf, the vet told me she might not survive that first winter. Too small, he said. Too weak." Thomas's fingers moved absently through the short hair near her ear. "So I slept in the barn most nights. Figured if she was going to fight, she shouldn't have to do it alone." Caroline smiled softly from the chair nearby. "Looks like she remembered." Thomas gave the faintest nod. "Animals don't forget who stands with them when it's hard." Maple released a low, contented hum, leaning gently into his touch. Later that afternoon, plans were made for Thomas's transfer to a rehabilitation center, and beyond that, the doctors spoke confidently of the day he would return home. When that morning finally arrived a week later, the sky was clear and brilliantly blue. The kind of cold day that promised spring was quietly gathering somewhere beyond the horizon. A wheelchair carried him through the hospital's front doors, the very doors Maple had walked through not so long ago. Staff lined the lobby, some waving, others blinking back unexpected tears. Just outside, near the edge of the parking lot, Maple waited calmly, her breath curling in soft white clouds. Thomas asked them to stop the chair. With effort, he pushed himself to his feet, leaning briefly on Caroline, before taking a few careful steps forward. Maple closed the distance at once, lowering her head until it rested lightly against his chest. He wrapped his arms as far around her neck as his strength allowed and closed his eyes. For a moment, the world seemed to pause. Then he drew a slow breath and smiled. "All right, girl," he said quietly. "Let's go home." As they watched the farmer and his cow begin the short journey back toward the truck that would carry them to Greenridge Farm, many would later struggle to explain exactly why the story stayed with them. Perhaps it was because it reminded them that loyalty does not measure distance, that love does not require words, and that sometimes, when the path back feels impossibly far, it is the ones we once cared for who guide us there. And long after the hospital returned to its ordinary rhythms, people still spoke of the winter morning when compassion walked through sliding glass doors and refused to leave until it brought someone back to life.